If you've ever started the year, or honestly any random Monday, with the goal of I just want to lose a bit of weight or I want to get a bit leaner, and then found yourself a few months or even just a few weeks later thinking, why does this keep going wrong? This episode is here to put an end to that cycle. The cycle that kept me stuck setting the same weight loss goals every single January until I figured out what I'm about to teach you in this episode. Because one of the biggest mistakes I see, especially in people who train hard, care about performance, and genuinely want to look after their health, isn't a lack of motivation or discipline or willpower. It's that the goal itself is way too vague, and with that comes an equally vague plan to achieve that goal. And I'm talking about goals like I want to lose weight, or I want to get leaner, or I want to tone up, accompanied with resolutions like I'm going to eat healthier, or I'm going to start going to the gym, or I'm going to start running, where there's no timeline, there's no structure, and most importantly, no clear plan for actually how that fits around training, work, social life, or just being a normal human being long term. And even when people do get a bit more specific here, like they decide to follow a specific training or nutrition plan, that's typically a short-term thing and they don't make a realistic plan for how the whole year is going to pan out. And so what usually happens is that you diet for a bit, you push through, you try to be good, but then things start to feel harder. You feel more sluggish in training and in day-to-day life, your recovery drops off, life gets busy, you have an off day that turns into a few days, and then that turns into a week, and then you feel like you failed, and then you either give up or start again. Or maybe you do manage to see your plan through, and I've done this before with iron-willed determination, and you get all the way to week 12 of your 12-week plan, and then week 13 comes and you have no idea what to do, or you're just so burnt out that you rebound and you rebound hard. And the really frustrating part about any of these scenarios is that you end up feeling like you're the problem and that you failed, when actually the plan that you were trying to follow was just never fit for purpose. And I want you to compare this to how we approach training. We don't just say, I want to get stronger and then train randomly and indefinitely. We use deliberate training blocks, phases with specific focuses. Maybe we peak for competitions and we use deload weeks to manage mental and physical fatigue. Basically, there's structure. But then with nutrition, most people are just permanently trying. They're trying to be switched on all the time with no breaks, no variation, no room for flexibility, no middle ground, and no real plan. And that, of course, is where today's episode comes in. Because I'm going to introduce and teach in simple, practical terms the concept of nutrition periodization, which might sound fancy, but all it really means is deliberately planning different nutrition phases across the year in a way that supports your training, your performance, and your real life, instead of fighting a constant uphill battle with no endpoint in sight. We're going to be talking about why general open-ended fat loss goals almost always backfire, why staying in a calorie deficit too long is one of the fastest ways to stall progress, and how you can start to plan things like maintenance phases, reverse diets, and even time off from dieting altogether to finally make body composition progress that sticks this year without burning out, wrecking your performance, or finding yourself in the exact same position 12 months from now. And by the end of this episode, you'll walk away thinking, oh, it wasn't willpower or discipline where I was falling short, it was having the right plan. So let's get into it. So before we dig into exactly what nutrition periodization is and how to implement it, let's zoom in a bit closer on what usually goes wrong. Specifically when it comes to wanting to lose fat and get leaner, which is typically where most people start. And the problem for most people isn't wanting to lose fat itself, it's how they approach it. Because saying I want to lose weight or I want to get leaner without any specific time frame, structure, or plan for what happens next turns what should be a temporary strategic phase that you dip into and transition out of into this weird never-ending limbo where you're just sort of permanently trying. You're always sort of dieting, sort of being careful, sort of watching what you eat, however you want to phrase it, but there's never a point where you purposefully take things down a notch or even celebrate your success and transition into actually maintaining those results long term. And so what that tends to end up looking like in real life is eating slightly less than you need for far longer than you should be. And you might start off with enough of a calorie deficit to be seeing decent results. And a calorie deficit simply means eating fewer calories than your body burns on a daily basis, which long-term results in weight loss. But without a clear endpoint, things naturally start to fizzle out. So you're still sort of trying, but over time that deficit just isn't quite enough to feel like you are making consistent progress. But it is enough to make you feel tired, to start feeling flat in training, for your recovery to suffer, and most significantly, for you to start getting fed up when the effort does not feel worth the reward. And this is especially brutal if performance is as important or more important to you than aesthetics, because performance is usually the first thing that starts to dip or plateau. And at first it's subtle. Sessions feel a bit heavier than they should, but you can kind of convince yourself that's part of the process, and it is to an extent. But those sessions that feel a bit harder and heavier than they should start to become a bit more frequent. Little aches, pains, and niggles crop up a bit more often. You convince yourself to trust the process, but all of a sudden you're 2 or 3 months down the line and you're struggling to see any improvements in body composition or performance. Not only that, but the training that you used to feel genuinely excited for, that you really enjoyed, is starting to feel like more of a chore, and maybe you're even starting to feel more irritable or drained by things that normally wouldn't get to you. And when people are in this position, instead of seeing all of these things as a red flag that there's a problem with the approach, this is where most people turn it inwards, thinking they just need to double down and lock in more. So they do some kind of reset, but each time with a little bit less gusto because they've never really given themselves a break. Or sometimes people will swing the other way and just say, fuck it, being lean isn't for me, whether it's blaming genetics or beating themselves up about lacking willpower or being lazy or some combination, and they fall right back into old habits until something at some point triggers the cycle to start all over again. And I know this pattern so well because I lived it for years. For at least my first 5 years of CrossFit, my version of goal setting was basically, I should probably be a bit leaner, followed by months of half dieting, still pushing training really hard, but then wondering why everything felt harder than it needed to. And then I would either rebound or reset with the exact same vague intention a few months later. There was never a defined endpoint and absolutely no plan for what came after the dieting phase, like how I'd start increasing my food intake or what habits I'd need to build or maintain to keep my progress, which meant that even when I did make progress, it rarely stuck and my performance always took a hit somewhere along the line. And this is a point that I really want to emphasize here, because this is the Unfiltered Athlete podcast where health and performance come before aesthetics. And that is that staying in a calorie deficit for too long isn't just detrimental to your body composition goals, it actively works against the other progress measures that athletes and active people in general care about. Things like building strength, speed, and fitness, being able to sustain intensity throughout a session, recovering properly, staying injury-free, and just feeling good and ready to train in general. And so being in this prolonged, indefinite, sort of half in, half out calorie deficit simply means that you are in a worst of both worlds scenario, where you're trying to lose fat, but you're not actually seeing any changes in body composition, but you're also getting all of the downsides to performance because you're trying to push through and ask for more from a body that is already underfueled, under-recovered, and exhausted. And this is why these open-ended goals almost always backfire. Not because fat loss is wrong and athletes should never pursue it, but because fat loss without a strategic plan, including what happens after the fat loss phase, is one of the fastest ways to stall progress and burn yourself out, especially if performance matters to you. Which brings us to the alternative, using nutrition periodization, not to complicate things, but to finally bring structure, clarity, and intention to your nutrition goals so that you actually get results from the effort you put in. So let's zoom out for a second and take a look at what this actually looks like in practice. I want you to imagine two people. Both train regularly, both care about getting stronger, fitter, and generally feeling good in their body, and both start the year with the intention of losing some fat. But they approach it in two very different ways. Person one starts the year saying, I want to lose weight this year. There's no time frame attached to that, other than the entire year, of course, which is way too broad and way too long to be in a deficit, so it's just a general intention. It's an open-ended goal. And they might go down the route of just trying to eat a bit less, cut back on certain foods, and maybe add in a bit more cardio or some more exercise if they don't already. Or they might get a bit more dialed in, start tracking their food, maybe trying to hit certain calorie or macro targets with the intention of being in a calorie deficit. Either way, at first, things feel okay, and maybe they're even going really well. Motivation is at its highest here. They haven't hit any bumps in the road yet, so they think it's working, I just need to keep going. But at some point, things inevitably start to shift. And because there's no planned endpoint, it might be after a few weeks or it might be a few months down the line, but basically they hit a roadblock, which could be any number of things. Maybe weight loss stalls, which crashes their motivation. Maybe training starts to feel harder or less enjoyable. They start skipping sessions or they get injured even. It could be that the mental battle of having no end in sight means that they feel burnt out or restricted, or maybe they just start to get a bit more relaxed with their eating or their food tracking without really noticing because it happens so gradually. Sometimes, especially for people who have really high adherence to their plans, physical hunger can be the thing that becomes unmanageable. Or it could just be life happening, things like social events, work stress, or a holiday that make it hard or impossible to stick with their training and nutrition habits. So eventually something gives. They fall off track, so to speak, reverting back to old ways, often with a dramatic rebound, sometimes with more of a subtle slide, or occasionally they might actually say, you know what, I need a break. Except by this point it's too late, and that break just feels like a failure rather than an intentional, smart and strategic move. And so they give up, or they double down with more restriction and just repeat the cycle. And ultimately, this person ends the year feeling like they've been constantly on it and trying, they've never had a break, but all they have to show for it is roughly the same body composition, potentially worse, less trust and confidence in themselves, and having left a lot of performance gains on the table over the course of 12 months where they weren't putting fueling and recovery first. Now let's look at person 2, and this is how you're going to be approaching things by the end of this episode, by the way. And this person also wants to lose fat, but instead of treating it as a vague year-long resolution, they treat it as a specific phase or period of time, hence the word periodization. So they're seeing fat loss as a phase, not a lifestyle. They plan when the deficit starts, they plan when it ends, what they specifically want to get out of this fat loss phase, and what happens next, and potentially even what happens after that too. To get more specific with this example, they decide they'll do an 8 to 12 week fat loss phase and follow that up with a reverse dieting phase, followed by long-term maintenance, and they might consider doing another fat loss phase later in the year, depending on how that fits into their training plans and, crucially, their life. Because nutrition periodization isn't about planning whether you'll be in a calorie deficit, surplus, or maintenance in a vacuum. It's about making sure you align your chosen phases to be realistic and effective in real life. And I'll dive into more detail about how to do this in just a moment, but sticking with this comparison for now, person 2 goes into their deficit in a completely different headspace to person 1, who had those open-ended goals. Person 2 already knows that once their fat loss phase is over, they'll be increasing calories, any temporary dips in energy, recovery, or performance will return to baseline, and they'll be consolidating the progress they've made. They're not white-knuckling their way through until they feel happy with their progress, because trust me, that is far too subjective to be at all reliable, and they're also not panicking or sliding backwards when their fat loss phase is over. And so as a result, performance stays mostly intact and even improves in most cases, especially if you're timing your meals properly, which I'll talk more about next week. Body composition shifts more consistently and predictably because your efforts are more consistent when they're over a shorter, definite time frame, and there's no big rebound where you regain any fat you lost during the deficit. And that's before we even think about all the additional progress that person 2 could make during their reverse dieting, maintenance, and any future deficit or even calorie surplus phases they might do later in the year. So they end the year leaner and stronger, confident in their ability to actually make a change and use food to fuel whatever goals they have, and without having to feel constantly on all year. Compare that back now to person 1 who hasn't progressed, who feels burnt out and lacking confidence, and there is such a world of difference. And that difference has nothing to do with effort or willpower or discipline. It all comes down to a simple shift in your approach to body composition goals. So now that we've looked at those two approaches side by side, and I've mentioned different phases a few times now, I want to break down what nutrition periodization actually looks like in real terms. Not with a rigid, overcomplicated system, but with a simple overview of what phases you should be using to get the most out of your nutrition efforts. Because at its core, nutrition periodization is simply the idea that your nutrition should change over time on purpose, based on what you're trying to achieve, what your training looks like, and what's actually realistic for your life. Just like with training, you wouldn't stay in a peaking block forever. And if you're not sure what a peaking block is, don't worry. You can just think of it like this. An athlete training for the Olympics isn't ready to perform their best all year round. Their training is carefully structured so that they can perform their best when it matters the most, aka when they are peaking for competition. In the same way, you shouldn't expect your body composition to stay static or peaked year round. So instead of thinking in terms of a forever goal, like I want to be lean, as if you'll reach some sort of end point, a final form, this elusive body composition that you'll finally be happy with and maintain forever, I want you to start thinking in phases. And there are 4 main phases that you need to know about, and each of them has its own unique purpose, and each of them are equally important. And I'm going to talk you through each one. Exactly what it is, when to use it, timeframes, and any considerations you need to make to get the most out of it. First up, we're going to talk about the fat loss phase, aka a calorie deficit. I've talked about this one the most so far, and I'm starting off with it not because it's the best phase or the most important phase or even the phase that you should be focusing on, but because it's the phase that most people start with. And it's also the phase that most people get wrong and, as we've discussed, get stuck in indefinitely. So there's nothing wrong with a fat loss phase itself. The problem is staying there too long or drifting in and out of it without ever committing to it properly. A fat loss phase should be exactly that. A phase, a specific period of time where the goal is to reduce body fat in a controlled, intentional way. And for most people, this time period should be 8 to 12 weeks. Sometimes you might go for a slightly shorter time, sometimes called a mini cut, or there might be occasions where going for a little longer might be appropriate, but I generally don't recommend anything longer than 12 weeks. The key thing here is that it has a defined start and end point. Now, the thought might have occurred to you, well, aren't we supposed to be setting sustainable habits, not dieting in extreme ways and then ending up rebounding? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. This defined time frame isn't about going to extremes during that time frame, like doing a traditional diet pulled straight from a 2000s magazine, like, I don't know, an 8-week bikini body diet or some bullshit like that, and then reverting to your old ways straight after. Instead, the time frame is about setting defined parameters around your fat loss phase, where there will be trade-offs, not extreme ones, but there will be more effort involved, and that's easier to commit to when you know it's not forever. And it's also about balancing your fat loss phase to be long enough to make significant changes, but short enough to maintain performance, reduce the risk of chronic underfueling, and of course prevent psychological burnout, which is a really overlooked component of fat loss. And as I've said, during a fat loss phase, there will be some trade-offs, especially if you've been training for longer. You might need to accept some performance trade-offs, like training feeling a bit harder or recovery not feeling quite as good as when you're able to focus purely on fueling without needing to worry about managing being in an energy deficit on top of that. So in a fat loss phase, you are not typically chasing peak performance. You're aiming to maintain performance as much as possible whilst nudging body composition in the direction that you want. That being said, most people that I've worked with who've started their fat loss phase inside the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint actually do end up improving their performance at the same time, because they're not just reducing calories in their fat loss phase. They are also improving their nutrition quality and using nutrient timing to maximize energy levels and recovery even on a lower calorie intake. But we'll dive more into pre-workout fueling next week and other elements of nutrient timing in the coming weeks. And you can, of course, head to the link in the show notes or description if you want to find out more about the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint right now. But basically, when it comes to a fat loss phase and your performance, it's important to set your expectations correctly. Fat loss is not the phase where you're trying to hit personal bests and everything or make the biggest strength gains of the year. It's a phase where the goal is to get in, get the job done, and get out. You don't want to live there. And when you get this right, you're laying the perfect foundation for the next phase, which is reverse dieting. Now, what exactly is reverse dieting, you might be asking? Well, it is deliberately and gradually increasing your calorie intake after a calorie deficit with the goal of restoring energy availability, improving recovery and performance, reversing any temporary metabolic adaptations that the calorie deficit may have caused, and essentially transitioning out of your deficit without undoing the progress you've just made. So it's that crucial piece that's missing from most fat loss attempts, where most people, whether or not they've reached their fat loss goals, get to a point where the diet is over and don't really know how to maintain their progress. They just go back to whatever they were doing before, and as a result, their energy levels, their body weight, their digestion, recovery, and even their hormones just feel all over the place. Whereas when this process is gradual, your body gets a proper chance to recover without the unwanted side effects that come with a rapid increase in calorie intake. But reverse dieting isn't just reserved for after a deliberate, structured fat loss phase. It's actually the phase that most people who've been trying to lose fat for a while, whether that's been months or even years of yo-yoing, should start with. So, for example, 9 times out of 10, when someone joins the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint with a fat loss goal and they share with me that they've already been trying to lose weight on and off for an extended period of time, whether that's been successful or not, I recommend a reverse diet first, because this is what actually sets you up for a successful fat loss phase. When you've actually given your body and mind a chance to recover from constant restriction, build actually healthy habits, discover what your body can do when it's fueled, and get your metabolism to a healthy level so that you can reduce calories later down the line without starving should you want to go into a calorie deficit again. So whilst the typical approach is to start with a fat loss phase, if you've been trying to lose fat already, especially if you've been struggling for a while, a reverse diet can often be the best place to start. And it's not that fat loss is off the cards forever, it's just that we can use reverse dieting first to maximize what you can then get out of your fat loss phase. Now, I am going to do an episode fairly soon on reverse dieting, so make sure that you are subscribed or following so you don't miss that. But to keep things simple and practical today, let's talk about what the specific aim of a reverse diet is and how to go about achieving it. So in a reverse diet, you want to approximately maintain your weight, with the exception of a potential pound or two of weight gain within the first week or so, which is when glycogen is being replenished, which I covered in my recent carbs episode, and you're maintaining your weight at the same time as gradually increasing your calorie intake, until you're at a point where any further calorie increases result in ongoing weight gain. So you're basically finding the highest calorie intake that you can maintain your weight on. And to do this, you are simply increasing whatever your current average calorie intake is by about 50 to 100 calories every 1 to 2 weeks, tracking your body weight weekly averages, calorie weekly averages, and assuming your activity levels are consistent. And once your weight has stabilized on this higher calorie intake, that's when it's time to switch to the third phase that I want to talk about. And this is the one that gets the least attention, even though it's the one where we should be spending the most time, and that is maintenance. So first, let's talk about what a maintenance phase is and what it isn't, before talking a bit more about how it fits in with the other phases. Most simply, a maintenance phase is where your calorie intake roughly matches your calorie output. And in terms of body weight, the aim is for it to remain stable over time, allowing for normal day-to-day fluctuations, not gaining or losing weight, just on average staying the same. And I think a lot of people avoid maintenance or just don't see the point for this reason, because they equate the scale staying static with progress staying static, which could not be further from the truth. Because a proper maintenance phase is a chance to consolidate the progress you've already made, whether that's fat loss, improved habits, or getting out of that constant cycle of restriction. That can't necessarily be measured on the scale, but it's way more important, especially in the long run. And remember that even when the scale stays the same, body composition can absolutely change. When you're training consistently, eating well, especially before and after training, and you're recovering well, you can absolutely build muscle and lose fat at the same time. And that's even more likely to be the case if you're not someone who is super lean or someone who's been training properly and eating well for years and years already. Maintenance is also the phase where performance can really come to the forefront, because your body has the perfect amount of fuel to train hard, recover properly, and not be either working overtime to limit any negative side effects of an energy deficit, or potentially struggling with feeling heavier, bloated, or sluggish if you're in a surplus, which we'll talk about next. So for this reason, the term maintenance phase can also be used interchangeably with the term performance phase, as long as we keep in mind that all phases should still be performance focused. It's just that a maintenance phase is where your body is best fueled to maximize this. Another key benefit of maintenance phases is that they're the phases that allow the most space for other priorities, things like social life, work stress, travel, without everything feeling like it's constantly kind of like in the way of your goals. Like, you know, when you've got a meal out and your fat loss phase is going really well, and it almost starts to feel more like a disruption or a stressor than something that you can fully enjoy. Whereas maintenance is where you can fully lean into these occasions and embrace flexibility, which is something that the complete guide to maintenance within AMB goes into loads of detail on, because there are so many different ways that you can introduce flexibility during a maintenance phase without feeling like it's an all or nothing scenario. So maintenance is not a pause on progress. It's not not a limbo period and I don't know what I'm doing phase, and it's certainly not a fuck it, I'm not dieting, I can eat whatever I want phase. It's a deliberate choice to fuel your body appropriately for what you're asking it to do. A choice that leads to better training consistency, better performance, and better long-term results than staying in a deficit for too long ever could. In terms of how long a maintenance phase lasts, there are a couple of key scenarios that I want to cover today, starting with arguably the most simple one. If you're not actively trying to change your body weight, if your main focus is performance, enjoying training, maybe seeing some body recomposition without a dedicated fat loss phase, and overall feeling your best, then maintenance can last indefinitely. And this is where most people should be spending the majority of their time across the year and even across their lives. And this applies to if, for example, you finish a fat loss phase and you reverse diet back up to maintenance and you're happy with the progress you've made at that point, and so you decide to shift to maintenance indefinitely. Let's consider another scenario. Let's say you have done a fat loss phase for 8 to 12 weeks, but when it comes to the end of that fat loss phase, you still want to lose more fat because 8 to 12 weeks just wasn't long enough to safely and healthily lose the amount of fat you wanted to. Well, in that scenario, I recommend going from your first fat loss phase, reverse dieting up to maintenance, and then staying at maintenance for at least as long as you were in a deficit for, preferably twice as long. And this is because fat loss phases are most effective when you've had a proper mental and physical break from dieting. Even if your calorie deficit is safe, controlled, and performance centered, at the end of the day, you are still spending all that time in an energy deficit. So the reverse diet and maintenance phase in between fat loss bursts is essential for stabilizing energy levels and getting you feeling strong, fueled, and consistent with your food and training, rather than turning larger fat loss efforts into one long, demoralizing slog where you risk chronic underfueling, under-recovering, and burnout. So it's important to understand that maintenance in between fat loss phases isn't just a quick 2-week pit stop in between 8 to 12 weeks of dieting before you jump straight back in. It's an important phase in its own right. I also want to say that there's no single correct order or timeline with these phases. What matters most is making sure that you carve space for maintenance within your nutrition plans for the year, and that you don't treat it as an afterthought or something that you just slip into by accident when you can't sustain your fat loss or muscle gain efforts. Which brings me perfectly onto the final nutrition phase that we need to cover, which is a calorie surplus, also known as a muscle building phase or bulking or a gaining phase. A calorie surplus simply means eating more calories than your body needs on a daily basis, resulting in weight gain over time. Now, of course, in the context of health, performance, and body composition, people aren't chasing any type of weight gain. They're looking to maximize weight gained from muscle. So it's not about gaining weight as quickly as possible. It's not about eating anything and everything for the sake of it. And it's not an excuse to neglect fueling your training and recovery. Just like fat loss, it's a deliberate, measured phase that forms just one part of pursuing your long-term goals, and it's not something you stay in indefinitely. And just like fat loss phases too, muscle gain phases make more sense to pursue sometimes than others. For example, when training is biased more towards strength and hypertrophy, like maybe the off-season for a CrossFitter or for a high rocks athlete whose strength and power output is their main limiting factor, muscle gain phases might also make more sense when overall training volume and conditioning demands are a bit lower, making it easier to actually stay in a surplus without feeling like you're constantly fighting appetite or fatigue, providing that your training volume and intensity is still adequate to stimulate muscle growth, of course. And then finally, but maybe most importantly, muscle gain phases are going to make the most sense at times where your life and your schedule are going to allow for consistent eating. Because for some people, busy periods make it genuinely hard to eat enough, let alone trying to eat more on top of that. It also doesn't make sense to start off with a surplus if you haven't already laid some sort of foundation with your nutrition. In the same way that I wouldn't recommend someone who's brand new to tracking calories or macros jump straight into fat loss, I also wouldn't recommend jumping straight into a surplus. Most people are far better off starting at maintenance and focusing on things like building consistent habits with eating, maybe learning how to track or start hitting calorie and macro targets consistently, making sure training quality and consistency are in a good place, and that they haven't just come off the back of prolonged dieting before intentionally pushing calories higher. And on that note, whilst in theory you could jump straight from a fat loss phase into a muscle gain phase, in practice I strongly recommend a reverse diet followed by a period of maintenance first. And in that case, that maintenance phase might be shorter than if you were planning another fat loss phase, but it's still really important because it gives appetite hormones, digestion, and energy levels time to settle and regulate. and it consolidates the fat loss that you've just worked for rather than just rushing into another big shift. So, the goal of a surplus is maximizing muscle growth whilst gaining weight slowly and steadily. I recommend having a time frame or a specific amount of weight you want to gain or are comfortable gaining from the outset, so that again, it doesn't become another open-ended phase where 3 months pass and you're not quite sure whether things are moving in the direction you want. And I also want you to anchor your expectations and progress measures to performance markers, not just the scale. Because when you're in a surplus, some fat gain will happen. And this is the reason that most people dip out of their bulk early, because they weren't really prepared to sacrifice some leanness temporarily to pursue more muscle gain. But if alongside a small increase in body fat, you're looking out for other signs your surplus is doing what it's supposed to do, things like strength and power increasing, potentially better recovery or tolerance to training with the extra fuel that you're taking on board, and maybe some size increases in certain areas that you're actively working on, like biceps or quads, for example, then you're much more likely to stay the course and make the gains you want to. And it's so important to realize that muscle gain is a much slower process than fat loss, so patience here is key. If you choose to do a surplus, expect to commit for 3 months at minimum. And even then, don't expect dramatic visual changes. Muscle is really dense, which means it doesn't take up much space relative to its weight. So even a pound of muscle, which is a decent amount, gained over a few months, when it's spread across your body, is not going to look like much. But that does not mean that you failed. And also, don't try to rush better results by pushing calories higher either, because past a certain point, adding more calories will only make you gain more fat, not more muscle, which long term tends to stunt people's muscle gain efforts because, as I've said, they'll quit gaining at the first sign of feeling a bit fluffy. I also want to point out as a final point on muscle gain phases that if your primary goal right now is to build muscle, this doesn't automatically mean that you need to go into a surplus. I've certainly built a hell of a lot of muscle over the years during maintenance phases and especially earlier in my training career during fat loss phases, because the lower your training age, the more potential you have for body recomposition, which is when you lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. And also, depending on your goals, like if your priority is maybe gaining strength rather than actual size, or if you're just feeling stuck with making any sort of gains and you're thinking, well, the only solution must be to bulk, then it might actually be that a proper maintenance phase where you learn to fuel properly, including eating the right calories and macros, potentially adapting these targets for harder training days versus rest days, and eating the right things before and after your workouts, is enough to go from a plateau to making serious progress without needing to gain weight if you don't want to. And this is, of course, all covered inside the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, which you can find out more about via the link in the show notes. But the key point here is that a lot of things that people think they'll only be able to achieve with a bulk can actually be achieved at maintenance when maintenance is done properly. And that brings us full circle to how all of these phases work together, because if you zoom out and look at each of the phases, fat loss, reverse dieting, maintenance, and muscle gain, you can see that none of them are good or bad or more important than others. They're all just tools that can and should be used at different times, depending on what you're actually trying to achieve, what your training looks like, and what your life actually has capacity for at that point in time. And when you see them as tools or phases to move into and out of, rather than treating body composition, especially fat loss, like a one-time end goal, everything starts to fall into place much more easily, with less confusion around what's going wrong or questioning what you should or shouldn't be doing. So before we wrap this all up, I want to link what we've talked about today to last week's goal setting episode, because I specifically talked about getting clear on your priorities, making sure your goals align with where you're at in life, and treating them as a long-term plan over the next 12 months, rather than an overly optimistic New Year's resolution that gets forgotten in a matter of weeks. And this method is exactly what you need to apply to nutrition periodization. So if you haven't watched or listened to episode 10, I strongly recommend going there next. I'll link it in the show notes too. And then as you're going through that, you want to be considering where the nutrition phases you've learned about today would best fit into the next 6 to 12 months for you. Because when you're clear on your priorities and your goals, structuring your nutrition to match will come much more naturally, which is really the point of nutrition periodization. It's not about complicated plans or feeling like you now need a color-coded spreadsheet mapping out every calorie for the next 12 months. It's about zooming out, getting clear on what you actually want, not just right now, but also where you want to be a year from now and even beyond that, and then choosing the nutrition approach that supports that instead of working against it. So here's how I actually want you to use what you've learned in this episode. First, get honest about your current priority. Not what you think it should be or an old goal that you've been holding on to or what Instagram's latest fitness beauty standard is, but what you actually want to feel and be your best self. For example, is it fat loss right now with the understanding that it's going to be time limited and intentional? Is it a pure performance focus, getting stronger, fitter, recovering better, and enjoying training again? Is it building muscle, or is it recovering from years of trying to diet and learning what it actually feels like to be fueled? And even if you identify with several of these goals, you still need to pick the phase that makes the most sense right now and that best supports your long-term goals. For example, if you want fat loss, but you've been dieting on and off already, then don't rush into a fat loss phase. Start with a reverse diet, then maintenance, then plan your fat loss phase for a time that's actually going to make sense. If you're performance focused and you haven't been dieting recently, maintenance is where you want to start, remembering that maintenance doesn't mean staying still. And if you want to build muscle, you might consider a surplus, but only if you've already laid really strong foundations. An alternative could be trying an effective performance nutrition focused maintenance phase first, and then consider a calorie surplus later down the line if you want to push for more size gains. So your decision-making process with your nutrition should be based on your overarching long-term goals, which you've set intentionally in advance, not based on a short-term, spur-of-the-moment decision to enter a calorie deficit because you've had a bad body image day, or a sudden switch to a surplus because you didn't do so well in a strength-based workout. This removes so much doubt, so much second-guessing, and allows you to pour your energy into confidently fueling whatever phase you're in, which is why I wanted this episode to follow on from last week's goal setting, because nutrition periodization works best when it sits inside a big picture plan. And speaking of the bigger picture, this episode and last week's have been more about the bird's eye view, but in the next few episodes, I'm going to be zooming in on the execution itself, which is going to apply no matter what phase you're in, starting with pre-workout nutrition next week. You'll learn how to fuel your training properly in any phase and what small changes there can make a huge difference to energy, performance, recovery, consistency, and body composition. So if today's episode helped you realize that it is not a lack of willpower that has been holding you back, rather it's been a lack of the right approach to nutrition, then make sure you hit subscribe. And if you want help applying all of this in a way that's personalized, flexible, and performance focused, this entire framework is exactly what I teach inside the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint, along with so much more, and you can discover that and get instant access today via the link in the description. As always, thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Unfiltered Athlete, and I will see you again next week.